So thank you everyone for joining us. Tonight is the final night of our Spring Into Reading Conference. And of course, we have our wonderful Bryan Kandel tonight presenting. So Bryan has been teaching languages for over 20 years, and he currently teaches high school Spanish in Canton, Ohio. As you guys know, he recently published that amazing guide to help increase enrollment in Libra language classrooms, which we already know and love. And that he also uses the power of reading as a tool to improve proficiency and aims to increase engagement with his students and help other teachers do the same. So Bryan, I will pass it over to you for your presentation whenever you're ready. Are you
Thank
able to
you.
share your screen?
Um, it looks like I am. Do you see my screen now?
No. I
No?
still see mine. Let me.
It looks like yours. It says, oh,
Oh, okay. I just stopped sharing, but hold on, let me see. Um,
it's yours.
is mine, it says building bridges.
Yeah.
You see
Bryan
mine now? I'm
313.
wondering, Maria, if you're
Oh,
seeing it,
okay. As long as they can see it, I'll figure out how to stop seeing
okay.
mine.
Yeah. So okay. Well, thank you. All right, good. Thank you. Looks like we have the right slides up here. My name is Bryan. Thank you. We're going to be very respectful of our time tonight, which is about 35 minutes. So we're going to jump right in. The idea here is building bridges. What do we do when a novel, article, any kind of reading contains vocabulary our students do not know yet, or cultural concepts that they've never heard of, or grammar they've never studied? We're going to talk about strategies for before and during reading to prepare students to engage with text and grow from the experience. So basically, the idea is building bridges because there is a gap. Our students are on one side, and the text that we want them to read is on the other. The story, the article, the novel, whatever. There's a gap between our students and the story. There are two types of bridges we're going to look at tonight. One is my students will not understand this text. And the other one is that my students do not care about this text. They do not want to read it. They hate reading, whatever. So it could be a gap in comprehension. There could be a gap in interest. And how do we bridge that gap? Like I said, this is going to be a pretty superficial look at this. We're going to be pretty short. So I want to make sure this is clear right away. This is what was big for me and what I hope you take away from this session. Just because there is a gap between my students and my text does not mean I cannot use it. Before, and maybe if you're new to using reading or readers or lots of reading in class, for me, I would get frustrated because I would see things that I wanted my students to read, novels or articles or text or whatever, and they just wouldn't be ready for it. And I would get frustrated because then I thought I couldn't use it. Well, the smaller the gap is, the better, but there are some things that we can do to make sure our students have a bridge and are able to engage in the text. So problem number one is this. I know that reading is an essential tool for providing input and growing student skills. I'm sure that's something you're seeing in a lot of sessions this week. Reading is essential. It's a great way to grow proficiency, grow skills, provide input. However, and we're going to look at the interest gap first. Problem number one is maybe my students do not want to read, or maybe they do not want to do anything. And this is something that this is a challenge that I face a lot. I teach some upper level Spanish classes, but even in those classes, I have some students who love reading, and that's great. I have others who don't like reading, and so that's a challenge. And maybe they're not interested in what we're going to read, or they're just not interested in reading, and so we have to bridge that gap. First thing, and this is something that if you've seen me do any session, I've talked a lot about this. It's a big part of the book we were just talking about. Reading works in a healthy classroom culture. And we're not going to spend a lot of time on this tonight. These are some of the keys to healthy classroom culture. But a couple I really want to point out, because I think this goes a long way in bridging that gap in interest sometimes, is that students understand that everything has a purpose. Students have to buy into the idea that reading makes them better. And a lot of that has to do with how we assess our students. If we're assessing our students' skills, if we're assessing their overall abilities with the language, then they can more easily see that connection because they know the more they read, the better they are at processing, and then the better they are at producing. So we have to all the time be emphasizing the importance of input and the importance of reading. The second key here that's important when we're looking at reading challenging texts is that students trust their teacher. If I can establish a culture of trust in the classroom where students know that I'm going to prepare them for whatever challenges they may face, they know that I'm on their side, they know that I'm going to be in class prepared every day. Once they start to trust me, then they're more willing to take on the challenge of reading something that may be a little advanced or maybe beyond what they're normally interested in because they know, they trust that their teacher is going to make it a good experience for them. So, looking at this bridge of students do not care about the text or maybe they don't want to read. First things first, compelling text work best. So we're talking tonight about how we bridge that gap between our students and their interest. I think I mentioned earlier, the smaller that gap is, the smaller that bridge is, the better. Now, sometimes we don't have any control of that, but if we do, we have to constantly be looking for compelling and interesting texts that are relevant to our students. We don't have time for boring text. If we read texts that are boring and we don't make it interesting, there are some real dangers. Number one is that if it's not interesting to our students, if they're not engaged, then now they're not going to try to comprehend it, and it is a complete waste of time. If they're not interested and they don't understand it, it's a waste of time. Secondly, if we present boring text to our students and we don't bring some life into them, they disengage from reading at all. And maybe the next thing that we want to read or the thing after that, they're not even going to try because they're so frustrated with this process of reading in the first place. And then they don't take our classes, right? Reading is such a big part of what we do. We want them to be engaged. We want them to continue studying and continue in these classes. So how do I know if a text is compelling? Two keys here is we have to spend time previewing text. If we're going to read a novel and we have a choice of what that novel is, we need to read all the potential novels and through the eyes of our students and know what would interest them the most. Then we also need to know our students. We need to spend time talking with our students and getting to know them. If it's a new group of students, the best we can do is go by tendencies and trends from previous years. But knowing our students and knowing potential texts will help a long way. A lot of teachers say, my students hate reading, which is sad. Or some of my students hate reading. How do I hold them accountable and verify that they are actually reading? This is a question a lot of us ask. How do I know that they're reading? It could be silent reading. It could be us all reading something together. What kind of assessments, what kind of quizzes, what kind of writing assignments can I use to hold them accountable for their reading? Not a bad question, but I think the better question is, how do I make my students want to read? How do I compel them? How do I bridge that gap and make them more interested in the text that we're going to read? For me, another key moment has been realizing this. I do not have to make my students love reading. I want to, I hope, and sometimes that happens. Sometimes they do change and they start to like reading and then they start to do it on their own. But I don't have to change their outlook on reading altogether. I just have to make them want to read this text, this chapter of a book or this article or this story in Voces or whatever we're going to read. I need to make them want to read this text. So what can we do? How do we do that? We can create relevant text. Now, one thing that's important here when it comes to reading, we're talking a lot about novels and stories and things like that, but reading happens every day. It's not only or always novels. In my class, we do trivia questions once a week that are filled with a ton of reading. We do songs, we listen to music, and we read the lyrics. That's reading. I tell jokes. A lot of the jokes are presented text on a screen. That's reading. A lot of the things that we do are reading. And those other types of activities, trivia questions and jokes, those are interesting and compelling. So if I can provide relevant text in that way, that helps the reading process a lot. If we're doing other types of readings, short stories, if you are comfortable creating that for your students or adapting something that fits more to your students, That goes a long way. Adapting, I'll talk about adapting here in a minute, but if possible, if you have the ability, because it's something you can print out, I know in a lot of the Voces platforms, you can adapt the text. Anything you can adapt, cut, change vocabulary, change references, make it more relevant, great. And then bring the text to life, preview the text, and make students wonder what will happen next. If I have this text, I can't adapt it, this is what we're reading, there are some things we can do to spark the interest of our students before we get into it. Pre-reading is a great way. Previewing a text before we read it. This actually accomplishes two goals. It prepares students for the language. It reduces that intimidation because we're going to read it a couple times. We're going to see a summary or a preview before we read it. But it can also be used to spark interest, reinforce details of the story, and provide extra input. Here's an example. So this book, this is one of my novels, El Carterista de Pamplona. This is chapter 14. Translated to English, this would obviously be in Spanish. But this is not chapter 14. This is a part of chapter 14 that I would use to spark interest before we read it. Arturo and Clara were running hand in hand, leading the procession of frightened tourists and angry bulls. Because all roads were blocked, their only option was to enter the Plaza de Navarra. The first floor of the building was filled with smoke and chaos. Some people were yelling fire, while others yelled bulls. Arturo grabbed the rocket and was headed for the exit when Clara let go of his hand. He was searching for her in the dark, with Camilo yelling in his earpiece, Arturo, get out of there and leave her. Arturo was reaching for her when, boom. So this is a chapter, a text that has a lot of action in it. So we could take a preview like this. Doesn't give away anything. It's not a spoiler. But it certainly presents the idea that something exciting is going to happen. There's fire, there's bulls, there's a boom, there's people running. It sparks interest and makes students wonder what's going to happen next. Another example, this is actually something I did yesterday and today. There's a story in level 3 of Nuestra Historia in Voces called The Arrival of Maria. And it's about Hurricane Maria that hit Puerto Rico in 2017. And so before we read this story, there are a few things we do to spark interest, to bridge that gap and get students closer to being ready to read it. First thing is I teach in Ohio and we don't have hurricanes in Ohio. So we have to talk about hurricanes, and we watch some videos about the destruction of Hurricane Maria, what it looked like, what the wind and the rain, because it's a foreign concept to us. And so for us, it's good to see what hurricanes look like. Seems like a very simple thing, but it goes a long way in sparking interest before you read. And then we did some acting. Now, there's probably other sessions this week where we're talking about like readers theater and using actors as you read. Always a great idea. It's also a great idea to do it before you read, because it sparks interest, because it kind of simplifies the story and helps students understand. And also it can be silly and fun and can just kind of raise the morale of a group because it's fun. And then when we go into reading, we are kind of more enthusiastic about what's going to happen. So for this one, I told the students that these are the characters I need for this preview of the story. I need a girl, her boyfriend, some people, a hurricane, a tree, and a police officer. And so then this was our first exposure to what was going to happen in this story. Oh, we took some pictures. I needed a photographer. And this, I'll just translate. So this is what I presented on the board, and then we acted it out and took pictures. There was a woman whose name was Natalia. She lived in Puerto Rico. She was pregnant. Hurricane Maria was going to hit or going to arrive in Puerto Rico. A lot of people evacuated. As we're going through all these steps, we're acting them out with the different people. Remember, the hurricane is a student. So we had a student spinning around to be the hurricane. Natalia was not able to evacuate because she was pregnant. She said to her baby, I wish we could escape this. Her boyfriend, Enrique, said to her, whatever happens, I am with you. These are some vocabulary structures that are emphasized within the story. And we did practice those structures before we saw this. Enrique did not leave Puerto Rico. The hurricane arrived. So we had our students spinning around, and he hit where they were staying. There was a lot of wind, and the streets flooded. Natalia and Enrique were in their apartment, and the baby wanted to come out. It wanted to be born. It was time. It was going to be born in a hurricane. Dun, dun, dun. So there is our moment of suspense, our trying to spark interest. We know that there's a pregnant woman in the middle of a hurricane in her apartment, and now the baby is going to be born. Her boyfriend drove to the car to the hospital, and she was in the back seat, and a tree was blocking the road. So we acted all these things out, and then I said, good job, actors. Thank you. You can go back to your seats. And every time in every class, what students said was, what happened? Like, what happened? Was the baby born? Did they clear the street? What happened? Which is the perfect question. That's exactly what you want students to ask. What happened next? Because now when we do read the text, they're going to read it more engaged. I have a couple of pictures here from yesterday. This was one young man acting as the tree. This was them driving their car. This is another class. Here's our hurricane spinning around, hitting Puerto Rico. We had lots of pictures that we used for a retell today as well. Another example, another story. I think this is from level 4 or maybe the AP version of Voces. Same idea. Looking at a story that we're going to read. Benny lived in Atlanta with his parents and his grandma. He went to a special school. His grandma took him to school in her car every day. She was Cuban and missed her homeland and everything about Cuba. Every night she dreamed about Cuba and was very happy. Every morning she saw the concrete walls of the other buildings. It was very sad because she wasn't in Cuba. So that's a simple version, same idea, presents the story, gets students kind of interested. So now that when we read it, they're a little more engaged to find out what happens next. Finally, with this idea of trying to make it more interesting, and I mentioned this earlier, but don't be afraid to adapt, to summarize, to cut. If you can, if you're able to, and it's permitted in your department, sometimes maybe you have a longer novel than you have time for, or there's some parts that you think are just a little not necessary or too long. Summarize them and move on. Like I said, with a Voces story, something you can adapt it, cut parts out, make it fit the interest of your students. That hurricane story that I just was talking about, I wrote it for Voces. When I use it, I cut parts out. It's a little longer than I want. There's some things I want to fit a little better to where my students are right now. So, if I'm okay to adapt my own story, then you have permission to adapt it as well. The second type of bridge that we face is of understanding, comprehension. My students will not understand this text. I know that reading is an essential tool for providing input and increasing understanding of cultures. I know how valuable and important it is, but my students cannot understand the text I want to read. Again, like I said, in the past, what I would do then is just not use a resource that could have been valuable. There are some things we can do to build a bridge between that text and our students and get them there. The first step and first key to this is to find out what the students do not yet know, which means, again, we have to preview the text and we have to know our students. We have to have that strong classroom culture where we know our students well. So when I have that text that I want to use, that novel or whatever, I'm going to go through it and I'm going to look for vocabulary and grammar that would be new for my students and make lists. Make a plan for how to best prepare them to comprehend the text. And if you've seen me do any session on reading before, I talk about this probably every time, and I still use it anytime we're going to be reading a new text. I use colored markers. I use different colored markers as I go through a new text, and I look at it with my students' eyes, and I look for vocabulary, grammar, or even like cultural components that my students wouldn't be familiar with. And I mark them in different colored markers. Important to remember, you do not need to pre-teach every new word within a text that your students may not know. You need to train students to use context and to focus on passages instead of words. And this is a concept that goes through any language, probably something a lot of teachers know and use. Um, Not to focus on every word and stop when you come to a word you don't know. But what I tell my students a lot of times is back up. Back up, look at the whole sentence, look at the whole passage, whole paragraph, whatever, and see if you can understand it. It may help you understand that word you didn't know, or you might find out it doesn't matter. It's not important. When I look at a text, there are 4 types of vocabulary that may be unknown to my students. The first one is something that's not important. The second one is something that could be understood with context. The third is something needed for comprehension. And the fourth is something high frequency and valuable for future use. So if I have those different color markers that I'm marking my text with, or I'm writing a list on another paper, I'm separating those new words and phrases into one of these 4 categories. Not important, understood with context, needed for comprehension, high frequency, and valuable for future use. If it's not important, I'd leave it. And I train students, we work on this idea that sometimes you don't know what a word is, you can't figure it out with context, and it doesn't matter. And there's a temptation sometimes of teachers to either define that word or remove it or cross it out or whatever. And I would suggest that you don't do that. Leave it in there, because we need students to be able to maneuver or handle a text when they don't understand some of the words. That's a skill that they need to be able. Same thing when they listen. They need to be able to understand a conversation or an audio if they don't understand every single word. So train them to not worry about words if they're not important. Understood with context. Very similar. I'm not going to define it. I'm going to leave it in the text. The difference with context type vocabulary is I am going to check to see if they understood it. And this is a skill we practice. Sometimes we'll have a text, an article, a story, whatever, and I will actually mark some unknown words, and we'll go back, or they'll write it, or we'll talk about it, and I'll say, what did that word mean? What did that word mean? What did that word mean? We will actually practice and check on that skill of using the context to discover what new words mean, versus something that's not important, we wouldn't even do that with because it's not important. The third type of new vocabulary is something that is necessary for comprehension of this text and probably not understandable based on just the context. If that's the case, then we're going to define it. Within the text, projected on the board, a piece of paper, before reading, in notes, whatever, we're going to define those words because they need to know them to understand this passage. Now, if they don't remember that word a month from now, that's okay for this category. These are just words they need to know for comprehension of this passage. The fourth and final category is when I look at a new text, sometimes there are words, phrases, vocabulary terms that are high frequency and valuable for future use. These are the ones that we really want to focus on. In that story I was showing you about Hurricane Maria, there was a phrase like, I wish I could. We spent a lot of time on that, not only so that they could understand it when it showed up in the story, but also now they can use it, and they do. There was a phrase in there, whatever happens, pase lo que pase. We spent a lot of time on it because that's a good high frequency structure that I wanted them to internalize and use after the reading. What you have to be careful with this fourth kind of new vocabulary is you're limited on how much you can do. You only have so much time. There's only so much you want to bombard your students with. So you want to be careful not to throw too much at them and expect them to internalize it. So you have to kind of select which words and phrases you think are going to be high frequency and really worth the time. Once you have those defined, you work on them with the students, internalize them, personalize them with personalized questions, use them in stories, use them in games, practice things, Quizlet, whatever. Drawing, I do a lot of drawing. Use that vocabulary in very meaningful situations to internalize it. So now when they read, not only do they understand, but then they take that vocabulary with them and assess it, reuse it. For me, this has been very helpful to know how to separate these new vocabulary and what to do with them. Remembering that there's a difference between recognizing vocabulary and internalizing it, dominating it, and being able to use it. And having students understand that too. There's a difference between what we're doing with this vocabulary and what we're doing with this vocabulary. Let me show you a couple examples. We got a few minutes. Bella Durmiente, I may have to log in here. Yeah. Bella Durmiente is a story in our Voces level 4. And if I am looking at that story, if I'm looking at that novel, and I'm going to look at, here it is. I'm going to look at chapter 1. And it's going to be different for every teacher and every group of students. So I'm reading through chapter 1 and I'm looking for new vocabulary and I'm looking for things in those 4 categories. And so we come, blah, 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 we're reading, and this it's defined here, but maybe it's not in their book, un casco. Casco is helmet. So now I'm going to decide. It's probably not something high frequency that I need to spend a lot of time on before we read. And honestly, it's probably something, so it protects her face against the cold wind and hides her long black hair. It's probably something they could figure out with context. So maybe that's something I'm going to leave in there and check with my students to make sure that they've understood it. I keep reading. Desgastada, like worn out. Her clothing, like her face, is old, used, and worn out. That's a word that I might just leave because old and used are already kind of conveying that idea. And they're probably going to get the idea of what we're going for, even if we don't define that. Keep reading. Manchado con el lodo, stained with mud. Maybe I think manchar is a word that's good for them to know. Stains that could be used in a lot of other situations. So maybe that's one we pull out and we practice a lot. Or maybe not. Maybe it's just one I define and make sure they know it before we go into reading this story. Say, I keep going. And you can do this chapter by chapter. You can do it for an entire book. However you want to divide up your reading, you go through and you pick out the words and decide what you want to do with them. Hey, another one I found down here was oro. What are they looking for? Gold. Maybe that's a word my students don't know, but it's a word I really want them to know because it's important for this entire book and it's something that they should know how to use. So maybe that's one we spend some time talking about, the word oro for gold. If I go back here and I open up that one went the wrong one. Okay. I am going to share these. You can look at that one too. It's a lower level example of a text, where same idea. The thing is, you know your students, you know the text, you know what words need to come out and be defined or left alone or used as context. After that, what's left is to read. And again, we're kind of short on our time here. This can be a whole hour. I'm sure there's a lot of strategies you're learning this week about the actual reading process. But once you have developed and sparked some interest, once you have prepared students for the vocabulary and the grammar, the things that they're going to encounter within the text, now the reading part is actually easier, more enjoyable. The one thing I think is super important when you do actually read is to vary how you read. Read together, read individually, read in groups. What kind of text we read novels, printouts. We read on the screen sometimes. We read on a computer screen sometimes. We reenact the sections. We translate. We draw. We do lots and lots of different things with the text when we read it. Again, we're trying to increase engagement, increase interest in what we're doing. And then we ask comprehensive and personal questions. And then there's a lot of things you can do after you read as well. There, again, when you have these slides, there's an article here from a few years ago about how we do our delivery when we read, how we can vary the reading process itself to add even more interest and engagement to the reading process. Okay. All right. Not too bad. So thank you. There's my email address there. There's my website here. It's bryankandel.com. I have lots of novels available. I have the book we were talking about, which is right here, the Give Them What They Want, which actually has some more detailed descriptions of some of what we talked about tonight. And thank you so much for your attention. Marie, I don't know if there's anything you want to do or if you want to jump right into the drawing.
Yes, thank you so much, Ryan. I work in marketing, so I really resonated with your message of knowing your students and understanding your audience so you can really craft the perfect, compelling message to them. So thank you so much for that wonderful presentation.